Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Snow was falling slowly over the rooftops in that peaceful neighborhood, as if time had slowed down just for that day. It was Christmas morning, and the Reynolds house looked like something straight out of one of those old cards with silver glitter and the scent of memories. Margaret walked through the living room holding a freshly brewed cup of coffee. Its aroma blended with the scent of the decorated pine tree and the loud laughter of children running barefoot on the soft carpet, dressed up like little heroes and princesses. The youngest, Jack, wore a cape made from a blue bedsheet, saying he was going to save the world with hot chocolate powers. Meanwhile, little Lila, with a crooked crown on her head, insisted on being called the Royal Pajama Queen. The kitchen was bustling. The sounds of clanging pots, cakes coming out of the oven, Ellie's voice asking her husband not to burn the toast. It was that kind of organized chaos that only exists when the whole family is together and everything just seems to make sense, despite the mess. Margaret watched from a distance for a few seconds, without interfering, just taking it all in. This was her life. Her now-grown children, each with their own quirks, their spouses, their grandchildren, reflections of the journey she and Richard had built over so many years. Ellie, the youngest, with cheeks rosy from pregnancy, sat with one hand resting on her belly and the other holding a plate of strawberries. From time to time, she looked over at Margaret, as though silently seeking support for the huge new phase she was experiencing. The connection between the two was obvious. Margaret remembered the moment she found out she'd become a grandmother for the first time and how Richard cried more than everyone else put together. It felt so recent, yet so distant at the same time. Richard, as always, was doing what he did best, touching people's hearts without effort. He was seated at the piano, quietly playing an instrumental version of Silent Night. The melody blended with laughter and the clinking of silverware being arranged on the table. It was subtle, but present. His eyes took everything in with affection, as if he knew life doesn't have to be grand to be special. He always said the real luxury was having the people who love you nearby and still wanting to spend time with you. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of being surrounded by it all. The fireplace crackled in the background, warming not just the room but also the corners of her memory. She thought about how many Christmases they had spent together, how many plates of cookies had been left next to the tree for a Santa Claus that Richard later ate on the sly, just to keep the magic alive. She looked at her hands, now with more wrinkles, but still steady. She remembered how they once held her children's little hands to cross the street, or how, with trembling fingers, she would fix her hair before an important interview. It was a perfect moment, almost sacred. That was when Richard approached her. He walked slowly, wearing a slight smile and an expression that hinted at something different, hard to define at first. He held out a small rectangular package, carefully wrapped in gold paper with a dark red bow. "Open this by yourself," he said calmly. Margaret furrowed her brow, not in suspicion, but in surprise. It was rare for him to request something like that. Christmas, for them, had always been a shared celebration, with no secrets and no private moments. She held the gift gently, as if it contained something fragile. She nodded slightly, forcing a small smile, and quietly went upstairs. As she did, the noise of the house faded behind her, muffled by the thick carpet on the steps. The upstairs felt colder, quieter. Each step echoed on the old wood, and that little package, which had seemed light before, now felt heavier than she could explain. She went into the office. It was a space they hadn't used much in recent years. Books sat on dusty shelves, curtains half open, letting in the white, gentle light of the winter morning. She sat down in the dark leather chair where Richard used to spend hours writing birthday cards by hand for each child and grandchild. He was methodical, detail-oriented. Every word he wrote was carefully chosen. Holding the present in her hands, Margaret hesitated for a moment. She looked around, as if seeking some sort of answer in the walls, in the old paintings, in the photo of them in their youth, smiling with their feet in the sand on some beach. Then she pulled off the ribbon, undid the bow, and slowly started unwrapping the paper. Inside the velvet box was a necklace. Thin, gold, elegant. When she opened it completely, she noticed there was something engraved. Tiny letters, almost impossible to see, yet somehow familiar. She held the necklace closer to the window light, and her eyes caught the inscription. The greatest gift of all. Below the necklace was a letter. A white envelope with her name written in a firm hand. Richard had always had a writing style that combined elegance and severity. Margaret felt a chill down her spine. Something about this gesture, this separation of the gift, told her there was more there than a simple token of affection. Her heart started beating faster, as though it already knew these words could change everything that magical morning represented. Margaret stared at the envelope with her name on it for a few seconds that felt far too long. It held only her name, nothing else. Just Margaret, written in neat, elegant handwriting, without a single correction. She knew that writing well, Richard always wrote as if each letter was a gesture of honor. He was the kind of man who thought before speaking, who calculated before acting, but who felt things deeply. Her heart throbbed unevenly the moment her fingers touched the paper, as if the world outside had gone silent. Not even the children's laughter, the crackling fireplace, or the birds singing on the porch could pierce the bubble of quiet now surrounding the office. With slightly trembling hands, she opened the envelope. The paper smelled of fresh ink. He must have written it recently. Maybe earlier that same morning. Maybe just hours before everything began. The first sentence was a loving greeting, like the start of an ordinary holiday card. But as her eyes moved down each line, the room's temperature seemed to change. The sweetness of the opening words gave way to something heavier. Richard wrote with his heart laid bare, but it wasn't wounded in any trivial sense. It was a hurt coming from somewhere deep within, from someone who had been struck in the core of what he believed untouchable. He wrote about time. About how the years had passed in a breath. How he remembered in detail the day Margaret walked into his life. How she smiled when she asked for a cup of tea in that coffee shop where everything began. He recalled the dress she wore that day and how she tucked her hair behind her ear. Every memory was described with such precision that Margaret found it hard to breathe. But then came the break. The story shifted subtly. He said he had felt something strange in recent months. A soft but cruel distancing. Small silences, averted gazes, laughs they used to share that had begun to appear elsewhere. Margaret felt a heaviness in her stomach. The next words hit with surgical precision. I found out there's someone else. Not physically, not yet. But in your heart, he's already occupying a space that used to be mine. She paused her reading for a moment. Her eyes were stuck on the letters, as if trying to erase what they had just taken in. Richard knew. He knew about Nathan. The letter went on with an unsettling calm. Instead of reacting with anger, he said he had felt grief. As if he'd lost someone. As if his wife had gone away, even though she'd been by his side all along. He described nights when he would turn over in bed and find only emptiness. Not a physical emptiness, Margaret was always there, but an emotional one. The lack of spontaneous affection, of conversation before sleep, of casual touch. With each paragraph, Margaret felt as though she were being ripped out of her own story, forced to look at it all from the outside. Richard talked about how he discovered the messages. He said he hadn't read them by snooping, but by accident. And even though there were no explicit words or direct confessions, there were glaring hints in the subtext. He recognized Nathan from a thank you card about some project, from the way Margaret wrote his name, from the new spark in her eyes when she mentioned her work. Subtle things that, together, formed a truth impossible to ignore. Then he wrote about the necklace. The one lying on the table as though it were just a piece of jewelry, yet carried more symbolic weight than Margaret could have imagined. The greatest gift of all wasn't referring to the necklace. It was referring to forgiveness. A chance. A choice. Richard wasn't begging. He wasn't confronting her with hate. On the contrary, he was offering something rare. A door left slightly open. A chance to rebuild. But he made it clear he couldn't move forward if she didn't shut that chapter with Nathan completely. The greatest gift I can give you today is my vulnerability. And maybe, if you want it, the hope that we can rebuild what's collapsing. When she finished reading, Margaret couldn't move. The letter was still in her hands, but it felt as heavy as lead. Her eyes burned. Her throat was dry. She pictured Richard smiling at the grandchildren downstairs, and that image hit her all at once. He knew all of it, and still he chose to be there, whole, that Christmas. He still made the coffee. Played the piano. Gave her a gift. She picked up the necklace and looked at the inscription again. Only then did she understand the magnitude of those words. The gift was Richard himself, offering all that he was, despite everything. It was a mature kind of love, wounded, but still standing. At that moment, Margaret felt something inside her crumble. It wasn't guilt, it was awareness. A bitter realization of what she had nearly destroyed in silence, day by day, hiding behind harmless messages, exchanged compliments, and emotional needs fed by vanity. Everything in that office looked the same, but Margaret was different. Richard's words echoed as if they had been engraved in Margaret's chest. She was still holding the letter, but her gaze locked onto some random spot on the carpet, as if searching for answers there. A throbbing ache rose in her throat, but above all, she felt something she could barely name, shame. A shame accompanied by a deep weight, as if she'd suddenly been forced to face everything she preferred to sweep under the rug. Her vanity, her escape, her need for validation hidden behind makeup and digital compliments. Now it was all right in front of her, no filters. The necklace lay on the table, too delicate to carry so much meaning. She touched it gently and turned it in her fingers, as though she needed to confirm once again that it was real. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, and images began flashing through her mind like an old movie in reverse. But this time, it wasn't Nathan she saw, or the recent thrill that made her feel alive for a few fleeting moments. What surfaced were memories of Richard. Simple moments, but full of truth. She saw herself younger, soaked by rain in a grocery store parking lot, trying to protect Ellie's birthday cake with a plastic bag. Richard appeared with an umbrella and, without saying anything, just shielded her with it. He didn't mind getting wet. He took the cake from her hands and smiled as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For years after, he'd say, that rain was worth every drop. Another memory came, the night her father was rushed to the hospital. Margaret was crying in the hallway, holding her phone like a ticking bomb. Richard arrived nearly out of breath after driving 3 hours from the countryside where he'd been at a meeting. He sat beside her, placed his hands over hers, and stayed there in silence, a pillar of flesh and blood holding everything together. More scenes followed, as if her heart wanted to shout that there was still something there. She remembered the day Richard sold his classic motorcycle, a gift from his father, to help pay for the fertility treatment that would give Ellie a better chance at getting pregnant. He didn't hesitate. He just said, "Family is what drives me. The rest is just metal." Then she recalled a nearly forgotten moment, the note. A little paper left in her medication box years ago, when she was going through migraine attacks and felt useless, heavy, and invisible. In the note, he wrote, "Even on days you can't smile, you're still the most amazing woman I've ever met." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. They weren't hurried or dramatic tears. They were thick, loaded with years she had stopped appreciating the way she once did. She realized that Nathan's appearance in her life hadn't been prompted by true love, but by emptiness, and an illusion that she needed something outside when it was actually right there within the walls of that home. She stood up slowly and walked to the window. The snow was still falling outside, but each flake looked sharper now. The trees covered in white created a movie-worthy scene, yet Margaret saw beyond the landscape. She saw the faces that mattered. The grandchildren, Ellie, the children, their spouses. And Richard. He was downstairs, present, whole, despite everything. He knew. And he was still there. She grabbed her phone. It was on the shelf, charging. Her fingers paused for a fraction of a second. She opened the conversation with Nathan. There were a series of messages, some playful, some flattering, secrets shared at times when Richard was already asleep. It was easy to fool herself in that digital space. It seemed harmless. But now, with eyes free from illusion, it all felt like a betrayal of spirit. She wrote with clarity, with no beating around the bush, like someone finally waking from a restless sleep. It's over. Please don't contact me again. What happened between us was a mistake. I was lost, and I used you as an excuse to run from what I needed to face in myself. But now I know what really matters. I have someone who loves me, even with all my flaws. And I choose him. I choose my family. I choose to be whole again where I should have stayed all along. She took a deep breath before pressing send. And when she did, it felt like she'd opened the windows of a room that had been locked for a long time. A room holding all the versions of herself that had forgotten to treasure what was essential. She went downstairs quietly. With each step, her heart pounded faster. The sound of the living room returned, the kids playing, Ellie chatting with her sister, the muted piano melody now playing something new. Richard was there. Sitting, wearing the same calm expression. She watched him from the doorway, and something inside her broke, irreversibly, but this time it was a necessary break. She walked across the carpet, almost unnoticed, and stopped beside Richard, extending her hand. He looked up, surprised. She didn't say anything. She just let his fingers interlace with hers. And there, in that silent gesture, the world seemed to stop for a brief moment. Margaret knew no words she could say at that instant would be enough. But she also knew the gesture, the choice, the return, those might be the beginning of something real. That night, when everyone was asleep and the house finally breathed in silence, Margaret woke earlier than she would have liked. The clock showed a little past 3 in the morning. One of the grandkids had left the guest room door slightly open, and the hallway light spilled in gently. The necklace was still on the bedside table, a living reminder of all that had been said, written, and felt. She looked at it with heavy eyes but a heart too awake to allow any true rest. It was as if the weight of that choice, to stay, to own her mistakes, to try to rebuild what had been shaken, demanded an immediate, practical response. She slipped on her slippers and walked out of the bedroom without making a sound. She headed down the hall to the guest room where Richard slept. They had decided to sleep separately some time ago, something that happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, like little cracks in old walls that you only notice when it's too late, and of course, Richard's loud snoring sped up that silent drift. She stopped by the door and hesitated. She had rehearsed many times what she would say. But in that moment, no phrase felt like enough. No words could capture the storm inside her. She decided to go to the backyard. It was cold, but she needed the chilly air. She put on a coat, grabbed a blanket, and passed through the living room to the glass door that led outside. Snowflakes were still falling in slow motion, as if time had stretched out this Christmas for a few more hours. She sat on a wooden bench near the lit-up pine tree. The lights blinked at a gentle pace, as though the world had decided to grant her a moment of peace to reflect. She noticed from the window that Richard was awake as well. His slow steps in the kitchen suggested he was probably getting some water, but when he saw the backyard light, he changed course. Opening the door, he found Margaret sitting there, wrapped in the blanket, eyes misty, staring at the sky. She didn't turn right away. But when she sensed his presence, she spoke softly, almost in a whisper, "I'm still here because I love you." And it's not that youthful, impatient, impulsive love. It's a love that understands it can fail, but it can also learn to start again. Richard didn't reply. He moved closer and sat beside her. For a while, they just listened to the wind rustling the trees and the distant call of an owl. Their silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was needed. A pause between everything that had been said and everything yet to come. Margaret slowly turned to face him. Her eyes looked different. There was a vulnerability only those who truly repent can bear. She held his hand firmly and went on, I got lost trying to prove something to myself, something I can't even name now. But today, after reading your letter and holding that necklace, I understand. The greatest gift I received was realizing that real love isn't always pretty. It bleeds, it gets tired, it nearly gives up, but it still stays. Richard took a deep breath, like someone mustering courage to feel again. After a few seconds, he nodded and gazed at the sky. The full moon lit the yard with a soft, almost bluish light. Then he spoke quietly, but firmly, I gave you that necklace because I wanted to give you a choice. And even without knowing what you'd decide, I chose to keep loving you. With no guarantees. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that, two old souls who, after losing their way, had finally found their path back to each other. It was a reconciliation without empty promises, without over-the-top declarations. A silent decision to keep walking side by side, one step at a time. The following weeks were challenging. Margaret had to look deeper inside herself than she ever had before. Their conversations, at first, were marked by long pauses, avoided glances, and inevitable discomfort. Richard didn't pretend to forget, but he also didn't use his pain as a weapon. He listened to her. Sometimes sadly, sometimes with contained anger, but always honestly. Margaret wrote letters. Many of them. In one, she left a note on Richard's pillow saying, "Thank you for staying, even when I didn't deserve it." Richard answered by sticking an old photo of the two of them on the fridge with a note on top, "We're still those people in this picture. Just a little more bruised. And maybe stronger because of it." Over time, the house regained its natural warmth. Ellie had her baby and named her Hope. The gesture struck Margaret deeply, because she knew how much that word now represented everything they were going through. The arrival of the little one brought the family even closer and provided new reasons to smile. But there was still one last unexpected chapter. Out of nowhere, a few weeks after Christmas, Margaret got a call from a mutual friend of Nathan's. The voice on the other end sounded anxious and troubled. She warned that Nathan had shared parts of Margaret's messages on his social media. Edited images, some taken out of context, others that never should have been made public. It was a desperate attempt at exposure, revenge disguised as righteousness. Margaret felt the floor drop beneath her. She ran to the computer and opened her social media. There it was. With captions implying she was just another bored wife looking for a thrill. Comments piled up. Strangers weighed in, judged, laughed. But then something extraordinary happened. A few minutes after the post went viral, Richard went on Margaret's profile and posted an open letter, not to blindly defend her, but to tell the truth. With elegance and clarity, he recounted what happened. He wrote about pain, about choice, about forgiveness. He explained they weren't brushing off the mistake, but rebuilding from it. He said that outside judgment would never understand the full intimacy binding two people. The post touched thousands of people. It was shared widely. Couples came forward with similar stories. People left messages saying they felt inspired to forgive, to try again, to look at each other with more compassion. Nathan deleted his posts. He disappeared from social media. That night, Margaret realized that real love doesn't need to hide. It can withstand exposure, shame, and, above all, it teaches. She lay down next to Richard, took his hand, and whispered before drifting off to sleep, the greatest gift of all was learning how to truly love. And being loved, even when I was lost to myself. In the darkness of the room, with the soft sound of snow falling outside, Richard gave her hand a gentle squeeze. It was the only answer she really needed. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.